Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic of this webinar is U.S. Renewable Portfolio Standards, a 2017 Annual Status Report. We have an excellent guest speaker with us today who will present his research on this topic, and this webinar is presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance for the RPS Collaborative. Our host for this webinar is Warren Leon. Warren manages the RPS Collaborative and is the Executive Director for CISA. Before I pass it over to our speakers, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of your webinar. You can call in using a telephone, or you can use the default option, which is to connect using your computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console so that you can see the presentation full screen, you can click on the little orange arrow that we have circled there, and that also allows you to expand it if you choose to do so. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we will answer as many as we can in the Q&A at the end of the webinar. So please make sure that you type your questions in as you think of them. Don't wait until the very end. We have a lot of people that we expect to attend this webinar, so we should have a lot of questions. So type your questions in as you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You can find a recording of this webinar, as well as all of CISA's previous RPS Collaborative webinars on our website at cisa.org/webinars. So with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Samantha. Well, as Samantha mentioned, this webinar is being hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we're a national organization, membership organization composed of public agencies, mostly state agencies in states across the country, and you can see logos of our members on this slide. And if you go to the next slide, one of the things the Clean Energy States Alliance does is coordinate the RPS Collaborative, which is an initiative that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. And it's designed to encourage dialogue and exchange of information among state RPS administrators, federal agency representatives, and anyone else who's interested in what's going on with state RPSs. We produce webinars like this one today. We have a monthly newsletter with free news of what's going on around the country related to RPSs, and we do an annual summit in Washington, D.C., which will be taking place this year in November, and I encourage you to attend it because it's the best way to network with people from across the country who are engaged with and interested in RPSs. If we go to the next slide, well, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab does the best job of tracking trends related to RPSs and keeping track of RPS developments in states around the country and looking at those to give us the big picture. And one of the things they do is each year they produce an annual report that summarizes the state of RPSs at that point. And this annual report came out recently, and it was spearheaded by Galen Barbose, who's our speaker today, who is a research scientist in the Electricity Markets and Policy Group at Berkeley Lab. His work over the past 16 years has focused on issues in the electricity industry related to renewables, to energy efficiency, to electricity system planning. And one of the things he does do is publish this annual status update on RPS policies. And he has an incredible ability to cover a lot of ground in a short amount of time. So catch your breath and get ready to hear about what's going on with RPSs. Let me turn it over to Galen.
All right, thanks Warren, thanks Samantha. I'm really happy to be here. Sounds like we have a good group of folks on the line. Before I get going here, I just also want to acknowledge that this status report is in some sense really kind of an outgrowth of the RPS Collaborative that Warren was just mentioning. As has been the tradition for many years, Warren and Samantha and their colleagues at the Clean Energy States Alliance have invited me, and before me, my colleague Ryan Weiser, to come and kind of give an opening talk at the summit, giving sort of an overview of the status of RPS programs around the country. We've been doing that for many years now, but starting last year, we kind of decided to go the extra step and to take that presentation that we were developing each year for the RPS Summit and to publish it more broadly as kind of a public document. And so that's essentially what this status report here is. The slides that I'll be walking through today are somewhat abridged version of the full report. The report itself is a PowerPoint document, but just in the interest of time, I trimmed a few items out. So with that, let's get going here. So as Warren mentioned, I am going to cover a lot of ground. I will inevitably end up having to skip over a few slides, but if I do so, hopefully I will at least have kind of piqued your interest enough to maybe ask a question about it during the Q&A or to take a look at the full report at some later time. So first I'm going to just give a little bit of background on state RPS programs, kind of talk about how these policies have evolved over time and some of the recent revisions that we've seen to these policies. So many of you have probably seen some version of this map before showing which states have mandatory RPS programs. Currently there are 29 states plus the District of Columbia that have such a policy, and collectively those RPS policies apply to a little over half, 56% of all U.S. retail electricity sales. The color scheme on this map has remained pretty stable over time. There have been 1 or 2 states that have joined in the past 6 or 7 years and one that's dropped off, but in effect this map has remained fairly constant, at least in terms of the coloring of the states. The RPS policies themselves, of course, vary quite a bit from state to state, not least of which differences in the RPS targets themselves and time frames, and that's what's kind of shown in the text boxes here. Most RPS policies have been around for a long time, most at least 10 years or more. That's what we show on the slide here above the timeline, where we list each state according to the year in which the RPS was initially enacted. And so you can see, kind of looking back over the past 7 or 8, 9 years, there have been relatively few new states to join the RPS family, most recently Vermont, and then before that Kansas in 2009. Kansas, as I'll note again on a later slide, is also the only state that has dropped off the map. They repealed their RPS a couple years ago. Now, even though there haven't been all that many new RPS policies enacted in recent years, certainly there's been still quite a bit of activity in terms of revising and refining these policies over time. Just to give some indication of that, below the timeline, for each year we've just listed those states that have made some kind of what we would sort of deem a major, pretty substantial change to their RPS requirement. In any given year there are, of course, many, many more states that have made other perhaps not quite major revisions, but this just gives kind of some sense of the continuing evolution of these policies over time. In terms of the kinds of revisions that have been made to RPS policies, there are a number of kind of general themes that we apply. Probably the one that is most significant, at least within the last few years, has been quite a few states have decided to extend and increase their RPS targets. In some cases, this was kind of motivated by the fact that states were beginning to approach the final year of their RPS, and so they decided before that happens to kind of re-up and increase and extend their RPS out further in time. Other kinds of revisions that have been made have been creating resource-specific carve-outs. Solar and DG carve-outs are certainly the most common, and those exist in about half of all RPS states. But then in recent years, we've seen offshore wind carve-outs, and we've seen kind of further refinements in existing carve-outs related to for example, community solar, shared solar, refining some of the DG carve-outs to distinguish between different system sizes, or maybe differentiate between kind of low, moderate income systems and others. So continuing refinement with respect to carve-outs. Long-term contracting programs have also been launched in many states, particularly in restructured markets where project financing can be a little bit more complicated, the reliance on unbundled renewable energy certificates for RPS compliance. And so we've seen some programs launched, particularly in the Northeast, to try to address that issue. Beyond those themes, we've seen a number of states continuing to refine resource eligibility rules, especially those related to hydro and biomass, and then finally some changes in the kind of geographical eligibility rules or other RPS provisions that might entail some kind of geographical preference for in-state or more locally sited resources. As I mentioned, there have been quite a few efforts over the past few years, proposals to repeal or otherwise kind of roll back RPS programs. There have really only been two cases where those pieces of legislation have actually been enacted. Kansas, as I mentioned, which repealed its RPS a couple of years ago, and then Ohio, which temporarily froze its RPS for a couple of years, but that freeze has since thawed. To just kind of dig in a little bit more into the revisions over the past couple years, the table at the top of the slide here distinguishes and kind of parses out the legislative proposals in terms of whether they sought to strengthen, weaken, or were kind of neutral towards existing RPS programs. And this is all based on data that consulting firm EQ Research compiles. So you can see here, I think the key thing to note is just kind of the balance between the strengthening and the weakening proposals. In years past, we saw kind of an even 50-50 split. Within the last year or two, though, that's shifted a bit, and so you can see, there have been basically twice as many proposals that have sought to strengthen RPS programs than those that were trying to roll them back. Of course, very few of these legislative proposals have actually been enacted. At the bottom of the slide here, I've just listed some of the kind of most significant revisions that have been enacted, and you can see that in most of those cases, the change that was made was, as I mentioned on the last slide, an increase or extension to the existing RPS. So that's really been a pretty dominant trend in the past couple of years. So with that little bit of kind of context, I want to now move to talking about how RPS programs have impacted renewable development in the U.S. thus far. And this is always a little bit of a tricky topic because there are, of course, many different policies and economic drivers behind renewable energy growth in the U.S. And it can be pretty difficult, if not impossible, to kind of parse out just the incremental effect of RPS programs. And so the slides and graphics that I'll show next here really aren't an attempt to isolate the impact of RPS programs per se, but rather really just intended to kind of give you a general feel for kind of the magnitude and scale of these policies' impacts and kind of what their role has been. So there are a couple different ways of kind of getting at this question. One of the most sort of simple ways is just to look back and compare the total growth in renewable energy in the U.S., that's the red line, to the minimum amount that needed to happen just to meet RPS requirements, but nothing more, and that's the blue line. And when you do that comparison, you can see that about half of the total growth in renewable energy in the U.S. since 2000 is essentially kind of the minimum amount that needed to happen just for RPS programs. Now, of course, some of that blue line might have happened regardless, even in the absence of RPS programs. So it's, as I mentioned before, not really a strict attribution, but it gives some sense for just the floor that these policies have provided and where that floor lies to relative to what actually happened. Everything above the blue line, of course, represents stuff that is in most cases really not RPS related. That includes utilities that are just purchasing renewable energy purely based on the economics. We've heard lots in the last couple of years about the growth of corporate procurement and other kind of voluntary green power markets. And then there has been, and I'll kind of come back to this theme at later points in the presentation, some states and utilities that are ahead of schedule relative to their RPS goals, and that have kind of procured more than they needed just to meet their interim goals, with the idea that they'd kind of get a head start on some of those later targets. And that is, to some extent, what lies above the blue line as well. So that's kind of the aggregate U.S. picture. If we look at it on a regional level, though, we get, I think, maybe a little bit more of a refined sense of really what role these policies have had. And let's see, you'll just have to bear with me. There's kind of a delay in advancing the slides here. Okay, here we go. So the chart here really basically shows the same thing that the last chart showed, comparing actual growth in renewable energy to the minimum amount required for the RPS, but just it does this on a regional basis. And you can see, looking on the left-hand side of this chart, in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic regions, the actual growth in renewable energy matches pretty closely to just the minimum amount required for RPS programs. And that gives you a sense for the importance of RPS programs in driving renewable energy growth in those regions. In the West as well, you can see a pretty close correspondence, though actual growth in renewable energy has been somewhat greater than the minimum amount required. In Texas and the Midwest, however, you can see really clearly that the growth in renewable energy in those regions has really far outstripped what the RPS is required. And so certainly within Texas and the Midwest, it's clear that other things are driving renewable energy growth, at least certainly in addition to RPS programs, but perhaps even more so. So there are a couple other ways to kind of get at this question of how RPS programs have impacted renewable energy growth in the U.S. One other way that we've done it is to actually look at it on a capacity basis and to go through project by project, look at every single renewable energy megawatt that's been constructed, and to look at what entity is the off-taker for each project, who's actually receiving the energy and the renewable energy certificates, and to basically kind of categorize each project based on whether or not the off-taker had an RPS at the time that they contracted for that capacity. What we've done here, and the picture that emerges is pretty similar. So the blue bars here show the megawatts built each year that are contracted to entities for RPS purposes. The kind of speckled portion above is everything else, and then the red line just shows the fraction of the total that's associated with RPS builds. And so you can see, similar to the chart that I showed a couple slides ago, about half of all renewable capacity that's been built over the past 15 years is being used to service RPS programs. So that again, kind of we get this 50% number. Over time though, you can see that the fraction of renewable capacity built each year that is really serving RPS programs, that fraction has gone down, the red line, but that's largely because total renewable energy capacity growth in the country has really taken off over the past few years. And so the RPS builds in an absolute sense aren't slowing down. In fact, they've sped up a little bit the past few years. Those are the blue bar segments. But as a fraction of the total, that fraction is going down. And just in terms of kind of what is that non-RPS capacity, I mentioned kind of generally some of the other drivers for renewable energy growth. In terms of the specific megawatts that are going in, much of that is wind capacity being built in Texas and the Midwest. There's also a lot of net metered PV capacity in California that is not really associated with the RPS program, and so that's a lot of that non-RPS megawatt. That's where that's kind of coming from. So the next slide here is ridiculously complicated. Oops. So I don't want to spend too much time on this. It really just does the same thing as the previous slide, but breaks it down into a kind of a regional perspective. I think the key thing to note here is the red lines, which again show the fraction of the fraction of renewable capacity builds each year that are serving RPS needs. And the basic theme is the same as what I mentioned on a couple slides ago, which is the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, and the West. Those three regions are really where RPS policies have seemingly been a more significant driver, where in any given year, somewhere between, say, 70 and 90% of all the renewable capacity that's being built in those regions is being used to serve RPS demand. In contrast, in Texas, Midwest, and the Southeast, RPS programs in those regions, although they are present to varying degrees, are a smaller relative driver. In terms of the kinds of capacity, the kinds of renewable technologies that are being built to serve RPS demand, this has kind of changed over time. Historically, wind was really the primary source of new renewable capacity for RPS purposes. You can see in the chart on the left here, though, that within the past 4 or 5 years, things have really taken a turn, and solar is now the primary source of renewable capacity being used, being built for incremental RPS needs. And that reflects a couple drivers. One is kind of ramping up of solar carve-outs over the past 5 years or so, but perhaps more significantly is just the fact that PV, especially utility scale PV, has gotten much cheaper and more competitive with wind. And so for that reason, we've seen, especially in the desert Southwest and California, a lot of the new renewable capacity being built for RPS purposes has been solar. Now, wind capacity is still growing strong. It's just that most of that wind growth is happening outside of RPS requirements. And we can see those trends a little bit more clearly here, where, again, we sort of, in each year, parsed out the wind and solar capacity additions into the RPS and non-RPS portions. And with wind, you can see, the last couple of years have been 8+ gigawatts of wind built in each year, but only maybe 20–30% of that was really being used to service RPS needs, whereas solar on the right-hand side, you can see RPS programs were a much more kind of prominent source of demand for those new capacity additions, and most of that was really to meet general RPS obligations. So that was kind of the past. I want to now sort of turn our attention to the future and talk a little bit about how much new renewable energy might be needed in order to meet RPS demand growth going forward. The first step in doing that is to maybe just to provide a little bit of a framing to note where various states are in their trajectory towards their final RPS goals. So RPS targets, of course, ramp up over time and until they reach some terminal percentage requirement. The timeline here just shows in which year each state hits its terminal RPS goal. And so you can see that in most states, about half of states say their final RPS target is due by 2021, if not sooner. On the right-hand side, though, you can see a pretty significant contingent of states whose RPS targets continue to rise out to 2025 or 2030 and beyond. The red states on the far right are all of those that within the past few years have extended their RPS targets out further in time. So in order to kind of understand incremental RPS needs, first it's necessary to look at the growth of RPS demand, which we will do as soon as the slide advances.
I meant to click on the screen again. Sorry, Galen.
Okay, here we go. All right. So here we show the growth in RPS demand over time. So this just shows the requirements, how much renewable energy is required in order to meet RPS targets in each year. And you can see that those requirements basically double from today out to 2030. Now that increase in demand, of course, does not necessarily imply an equivalent increase in supply. Some utilities or regions may be ahead of schedule, and so they don't need as much supply as their demand increases, whereas other states and utilities might be behind schedule, in which case they need more supply than what just the increase in RPS demand would suggest. Added to that is this kind of esoteric issue of REC banking. So most states allow utilities or other load-serving entities to bank renewable energy certificates that they procure in one year if they don't need them for compliance in that year, and then use them for compliance in some later year. But those REC banking rules vary quite a bit from state to state in terms of how long a REC can be banked and what kind of vintages can be banked. And so that adds quite a bit of complexity into this picture. What we've done on this next slide is really try to account for all of that. So what we've done is basically go through state by state, in some cases utility by utility, look at how much renewable energy is currently being procured and is available for RPS compliance, and then compare that to future RPS demand, taking into account the state-specific REC banking rules. And so the chart here shows really our best estimate of incremental RPS supply needs. So how much additional RPS generation actually needs to come online in order to meet future RPS goals. And basically you're looking at about 150 terawatt hours of additional renewable generation by 2030. To put that into context, that's about half of total U.S. renewable energy generation currently. So pretty significant ramp up just for RPS needs. In terms of where those incremental needs exist across the country, you can see that California represents the largest share. California, of course, recently extended its RPS out to 2030 and increased its goal to 50%. And so that is why California is such a large share. After California, you can see Mid-Atlantic and the Northeastern regions each represent about 25% of the incremental supply needs. In the case of the Northeast, most of that is New York, which has its own 50% by 2030 requirement. So the next set of slides I'm going to present here are basically a different, essentially various ways of presenting the data that we were just looking at, different ways of kind of looking at the incremental renewable generation needs state by state and region by region. One way of doing that, as I've done on the slide here, is to show incremental RPS needs as a percentage of statewide retail electricity sales. And so this gives you kind of a way of kind of scaling the incremental needs across states to understand sort of relatively, how each state sort of is positioned relative to others. And you can see, of course, wide variations as we'd expect. On the left-hand side, there are 8 states from Iowa to Pennsylvania that have either entirely met their final RPS targets or have nearly done so, and basically have little or no incremental RPS needs. Conversely, on the right-hand side, you've got 8 states that still need to increase their RPS procurement by 10% of retail sales or more. Those are states that in general have pretty high RPS targets, though also important is just the currently available supply, and as I mentioned, this kind of esoteric issue related to REC banking. On a capacity basis, about 18 gigawatts of additional renewable capacity will be needed by 2020 and 55 gigawatts by 2030 in order to meet this RPS, these incremental RPS needs. That's equivalent to about 40% increase. And I think that the important kind of incremental aspect to note on this slide is just to see where each region is and how much renewable energy capacity is already under development compared to those incremental needs. And so you can see that, for example, in California, 5 gigawatts of additional renewable capacity needed by 2020, but a good portion of that is already under development. Similarly, the rest of the West and in the Midwest, you've got even more under development than what will be needed. So this just gives kind of some sense of where the incremental investment in development opportunities might exist. Sorry, waiting for the slide to advance here. So here we're looking at something similar, the incremental capacity needs just for solar and DG carve-outs. I think the key thing to note here is that about half, I would say, of all states with solar or DG carve-outs have already met their final carve-out requirements and therefore have no incremental needs. Most of the incremental carve-out requirements or carve-out needs are in Illinois, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, and collectively about 8 gigawatts of additional solar will be needed just for the purpose of meeting these carve-outs by 2030. I think here's the last of the slides in this series, and this is just kind of backing up and looking at things from a national perspective again. The red line here shows total U.S. renewable energy generation as a percentage of retail electricity sales. So today, about 10% of U.S. Electricity consumption is provided by renewable energy, non-hydro renewables. To just sort of minimally meet RPS demand growth, that percentage would need to rise to about 13% by 2030. But as we expect, of course, there are lots of other drivers for renewable energy growth that will continue to exist over the next 10 to 15 years. And so recent projections here, we show the EIA's annual energy outlook from this past year. They project that the U.S. will get to about 18% renewable energy by 2030. So well beyond that kind of minimal 13% needed just to meet RPS growth. But this kind of gives you a sense of where RPS programs lie within kind of the broader range of drivers for renewable energy growth going forward. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through the last few sections, and the remainder of the report really deals with kind of a couple interrelated aspects of RPS performance, and kind of understanding how states and utilities have performed, both in terms of whether or not they've actually succeeded in meeting the interim RPS targets so far, and then secondly, what the cost has been of complying with RPS programs. So on the compliance side, most states have really kind of met in entirety their interim RPS targets, and we will see that momentarily. Here we go. So the figure here, these show the percentage of interim RPS goals that each state achieved. 100% means that the target was fully achieved. These are interim RPS targets, to be sure, not the final ones. But you can see that most states are at that 100% mark. They've successfully met their interim targets in the most recent year. There have been a few isolated cases where states have fallen short, in general due to kind of what I would say is kind of one-off issues, not particularly interesting or generalizable. I think the main takeaway here is that as a general matter, states have been able to meet their interim RPS targets. I want to talk real quickly about REC prices. And REC prices are kind of the connecting tissue between RPS compliance and RPS. When states are successful in meeting their RPS targets, REC prices tend to be low. In contrast to if states are short relative to their RPS goals, REC prices tend to be high. And in either case, that has implications for compliance costs. So here we can just really quickly see Class 1 REC prices within New England and PJM states. And I think the main point to note here is, I guess, well, several-fold. First is that REC prices really are a function of the balance between supply and demand. As I mentioned, if supply is greater than demand, then REC prices are low. Conversely, if supply is less than demand, REC prices tend to be high, rising towards the ACP, Alternative Compliance Payment Rate. We can see, looking at the chart on the top, that in New England, REC prices have fallen pretty substantially over the past year or two as more supply has come online. In the Mid-Atlantic, on the bottom slide, you can see sort of two different kind of clusterings of lines. There's sort of the group of lines at the higher up. Those are states that have relatively more restrictive eligibility rules and therefore higher REC prices. And then you've got that cluster of lines at the bottom that these are states that have pretty loose geographic eligibility requirements and therefore tend to have quite low REC prices. And this all has implications for how much it costs to meet these requirements and how much utilities are spending on RECs. Here we're just looking at renewable energy certificate prices for solar carve-out requirements, SREC prices. I think the main point to note here is that SREC prices tend to be relatively high compared to Class 1 RECs, and that's primarily due to the fact that the alternative compliance payment rates for solar carve-outs are relatively high. Unlike kind of the Class 1 markets, you don't really see clusterings of states here. These are, for all intents and purposes, kind of state-by-state markets. There's not a lot of kind of regional trading of SRECs, at least as far as solar carve-outs are concerned. And so that's why you don't see much clustering on the slide here. So now I want to very quickly go through the last bit of the talk and discuss just some highlights related to RPS compliance costs and cost caps. First, just to be clear, when I talk about compliance costs, what I'm referring to is the net cost to utilities serving entities responsible for meeting RPS requirements. And the way that we calculate those net costs differ between restructured markets, where compliance is primarily being met through unbundled renewable energy certificates, and regulated markets, where compliance is primarily being met through bundled PPAs or utility-owned resources. In the former, we calculate compliance costs really just as the sum of expenditures on RECs and ACPs. For regulated markets, however, we rely primarily on compliance cost estimates that utilities themselves or their PUCs produce, and just do a little bit of kind of massaging on our end so that things can be compared on as close to an apples-to-apples basis as possible. But at least for those regulated markets, we're largely just kind of compiling and synthesizing cost estimates that utilities and PUCs have developed. Rolling all of these compliance cost numbers together into U.S. totals, we get what is shown here with total U.S. RPS compliance costs equal to about $3 billion in 2015, and that was up from $2.4 billion in the prior year. That year-over-year growth is largely just due to the fact that RPS targets are increasing, and so procurement volumes are increasing. Of course, REC prices are also fluctuating, and to some extent, the decline in REC prices that began to occur in 2015, but really has occurred more prominently in 2016, that's helped to dampen, to some extent, this cost growth. You can see on the slide here, we've broken up these costs into two different buckets, and you can see that the portion associated with solar and DG carve-outs has been growing particularly fast and is representing an increasing share of total RPS compliance costs, even though it's a relatively small share of the total number of megawatt hours that are actually being procured to meet RPS goals. So $3 billion is a big number. As a percentage of retail electricity bills, that comes out to about 1.6% of average retail electricity bills in RPS states. In 2015, you can kind of think about that as a proxy, a somewhat rough one, but a proxy for the rate impact of RPS programs. That's just an average number, though, across RPS states, and compliance costs vary quite a bit from state to state, as the red bars here suggest that these percentile bands, and as the next slide will show more explicitly. So here we show compliance costs, again, as a percentage of retail electricity bills on a state-by-state basis over a period of time. And you can see, of course, as I mentioned on the last slide, just really widespread variation from state to state. That variation reflects obvious things like differences in the RPS target levels from one state to the next, differences in the resource tiers, REC prices, and so forth. It also reflects things like varying degrees of reliance on pre-existing resources. So, for example, in Missouri, on the right-hand side, you can see very small, non-existent, in fact, compliance costs for a number of years, and that's partially due to the fact that utilities in that state rely to a significant degree on pre-existing renewable facilities that were built before the RPS was enacted, and therefore entail no kind of incremental compliance cost associated with the RPS. Within that right-hand chart, there's also a fairly significant degree of variation due just to differences in kind of calculation methods. And you can very clearly with California, where we've actually presented two different sets of compliance cost estimates, one from the Public Utility Commission and one from the Investor-Owned Utilities. Those compliance cost estimates differ in terms of the assumptions and methods used to estimate avoided costs, and that's what drives really that huge difference in the ultimate RPS compliance cost number. Going forward, of course, RPS targets will continue to rise, which, all else being equal, would tend to put upward pressure on compliance costs, but cost increases are limited by kind of safety valves, by cost containment mechanisms that exist in most states. And what we've done here, the red lines on the chart show compliance cost caps that exist in each state. And just to give you a sense of kind of what's the upper limit in terms of how high compliance costs could conceivably go given these safety valves that states have built into their policies. And so you can see on the left-hand side, those states that rely primarily on alternative compliance payment rates as their cost containment mechanism. In general, you're looking at sort of no more than, say 5 to, at the extreme, 20%, but in most cases more like 10 to 15% rate impact. Whereas those states on the right-hand side, which have some other form of cost containment, usually it's an explicit cap on revenue requirements associated with RPS compliance, or a cap on the surcharge or other cost recovery mechanism that utilities can levy on customers. For those states, the effective cap is generally much lower, typically in the kind of 1 to 4% range. And you can see on the chart where we've also shown actual historical compliance costs for the most recent available year, that in some of those states on the right-hand side, they are getting close to bumping their cost cap. And in at least one state, New Mexico, there have been cases where utilities have been granted variances from their RPS obligations as a result of hitting that cost cap. So that's it in terms of my presentation. I'll just kind of maybe skip this last kind of conclusion slide and just bring us to the final slide here. I want to thank all of you for joining and bearing with this rapid succession of figures. Before going to the Q&A, I do want to just point all of you to the URL address at the top of the slide here, rps.lbl.gov. That's kind of our clearinghouse website that we set up, where we post all of our RPS-related materials, including the full version of our RPS status report, along with various data files and other kind of topical studies that have looked at costs and benefits and program design and other RPS-related issues. So with that, I will hand it over to Warren, who I trust has a nice queue of questions ready for me.
I do have a nice queue of questions, and in fact, there are so many, we will probably run over not a lot of extra time, but maybe 5 minutes over, and so we can get to a few extra questions. So one question goes back to the beginning of the presentation when you were talking about changes that have been made to RPSs in recent years. And one person asked, what's been the goal of recent changes that have related to hydro resource eligibility? Has it been to allow existing large hydro to qualify, or is it changing eligibility for new hydro, or something else?
Yeah, so this is definitely an in-the-weeds kind of question, and will strain my recollection of the specific changes. So I do know that, for example, in this past year, there were some changes in Ohio that I believe sort of expanded the vintage eligibility requirements for small hydro. So in some cases, it's being more explicit about allowing not only new small hydro, but also perhaps older small hydro to qualify as well. There has been some, I think, effort to expand eligibility to large hydro as a way of basically making it easier for utilities to meet their requirements. There haven't been, at least as far as I can recall, any kind of recent instances where that any sort of dramatic expansion of hydro eligibility has happened. I think these changes tend to be sort of more on the periphery in terms of kind of dealing with sort of size and vintage issues, but not necessarily to the extreme of allowing all large hydro to qualify.
Okay, one person wants to know about bundling of the electricity with the RECs and whether there's a trend towards that or away from that, and are states requiring bundling of electricity and RECs more, or are they not really making that a requirement for participation in their RPS?
Yes, I mean this really this issue I think is most kind of relevant in the case of restructured markets with retail choice. In regulated markets, of course, utilities tend to just do bundle PPAs anyway, so there doesn't often need to be any explicit kind of policy support or guidance towards that. But for restructured markets, it's a little bit different because typically load-serving entities are reluctant to enter into long-term contracts because they don't have long-term certainty over their load obligations, since customers can switch. And so I think what we've seen, and certainly there are kind of others who have kind of more in-depth understanding of the kind of specific programs that have been launched in the Northeast, but there have been quite a few efforts in recent years to sort of essentially require that the distribution utilities enter into long-term contracts and serve as kind of a contracting agent in effect for their customers. So it's really been in restructured states that this has happened, and I don't know sort of what percentage of total obligations are in those states are now being served through bundled contracts, but it's becoming a non-negligible fraction, certainly.
Okay. A couple people wrote in about energy storage and noted that you hadn't mentioned that in your presentation, and want to know if there's been a trend towards considering energy storage as a central part of RPS, or has that not come into things very much? And I will note, for folks who are interested in that topic, there is a paper that was published by the RPS Collaborative that you could get on our website, which is on the topic of energy storage and RPSs. But I don't know, Galen, if you have a short capsule summary about how energy storage fits or doesn't fit.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and Warren, you may actually be able to answer this better than I can, but I would say, I mean, in general, storage is sort of a supportive or enabling technology for renewable energy, but is not usually sort of one of the eligible technologies within an RPS. Now there are a few exceptions to that. I mean, certainly there are some states that allow fuel cells, which is not really quite the same thing, but are sort of can be used essentially as a form of storage to qualify. There are maybe one or two states that do sort of provide essentially kind of an extra little multiplier kicker, as it were, for renewable energy that is used to charge storage and then dispatched from the storage on peak. So there are kind of there are some mechanisms out there that have been integrated more explicitly into RPS programs in order to kind of provide an incentive for storage, or really for storage used in conjunction with renewable energy.
Okay, and one person observing the presentation and looking at some of your charts noticed that there was not an exact correlation between which states have ambitious RPSs and which states one might think of as states that have political climates that are very supportive of renewable energy development or tend to be supportive of environmental action. What are some of the reasons in your mind that might suggest why a state would have not have as strong an RPS as one would have thought when you look around at some of its neighbors?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could probably be traced to a number of different factors. I mean, one might just be kind of the extent to which sort of that how resource rich that state is or the region is. I mean, some parts of the country are blessed with really great wind resources or really great solar resources, and so in those regions, policymakers might feel like they have kind of greater ability to ramp up the RPS target or to adopt relatively aggressive targets. In other places, especially I would say in more populated parts of the country where it can be difficult to build things and where transmission may be more difficult as well, there might be a natural reluctance just for fear that the megawatts or gigawatt hours just couldn't get there. So that might be part of it. Part of it is and kind of related to that is kind of concerns about rate impacts. So, you know, different parts of the country have, you know, different electricity rates and have experienced varying degrees of rate escalation in recent years. So there may be, you know, regions of the country where politically you'd think they would be ripe for adopting more aggressive RPSs, but policymakers there may just not have the appetite given increases in retail rates that have happened in recent years.
Okay, good. And I would point out that we're going to have another webinar on October 12th, which is going to look at this issue of what are some of the factors that influence public support for RPSs and what are some of the factors that lead to a state supporting a strong RPS or not. So I'd encourage folks to sign up for that webinar. And also, if you didn't mind, Galen, if you could go back to the previous slide on your future outlook and keep that up for a couple minutes in case people want to read that slide while they're listening to other questions. One person wanted to know, what's the reason why Massachusetts compliance costs are a higher percentage of average retail electricity rates than some of the other states in the New England region?
Yes, I mean, I think that it ultimately comes down to differences in the targets, REC prices, and kind of the composition of the RPS in terms of the size of the solar carve-out relative to the overall RPS. So Massachusetts, I mean, does have relatively aggressive RPS requirement compared to some of its neighboring states, and has, I would say, especially aggressive solar carve-out requirements in the form of initially the SREC 1 and SREC 2 programs and now the SMART program. And SREC prices under at least the SREC 1 and SREC 2 program were pretty high, you know, $300, $400 a megawatt hour, I believe. And so, you know, those add up pretty quick, especially when you've got a large solar carve-out.
Okay. And have you considered performing an analysis of the implications for states if all states had a uniform RPS? In other words, if there was a national RPS, would the Western and Midwest oversupply be absorbed and demand unmet? By what amounts? What would that be like? Or is that something you haven't given consideration to?
Well, we haven't given consideration to that specific study, but I mean, I think it's a really important point. And even without sort of venturing into sort of a hypothetical scenario where all states have the same target, I think you could even just look at the existing set of targets and ask that same question. I mean, there's a lot of renewable energy generation in the Midwest, and there's a lot of kind of residual RPS demand in the Mid-Atlantic. And so I think it's natural to ask, well, how much of that kind of, surplus, as it were, renewable generation in the Midwest might make its way over to the Mid-Atlantic for RPS compliance. And a lot of that just comes down to issues of transmission access and the cost of basically transporting that energy from one RTO to another. So, I mean, the issues are partly physical, but partly kind of institutional. And although we haven't kind of looked at that question in detail, I think it's a really interesting one to ask sort of, what would need to happen in order to sort of unlock, you could say, all of that surplus Midwestern wind energy so that it could be kind of directed towards RPS compliance in PJM.
Okay, here's what someone else wrote, which is somewhat related to this last point. Isn't it conceivable that the impact of RPS programs goes well beyond the amount of additions needed to meet RPSs by driving market development, achieving economies of scale, and the development of renewables in neighboring states to serve RPS markets?
Yeah, I like that question. Yes, that is true for sure. Yeah, so I mean, early on in the talk, I was discussing sort of the role of RPS programs in driving renewable energy development, and it was really kind of a megawatt counting exercise or gigawatt hour counting exercise, and I think what that questioner suggested is absolutely correct. I mean, there are spillover benefits from RPS policies. I mean, part of why we've seen so much growth in renewable energy outside of RPS programs is because of these technologies has come down, and the renewable energy industries in the U.S. have developed and matured. And one argument for why that was able to happen is that you had these policies in place that provided kind of a stable foundation, kind of a guaranteed 5 gigawatts a year or whatever associated with RPS demand, and that kind of provided a foothold for the industry to develop and for cost reductions to occur and now enable all of this kind of economic growth in renewable generation.
Well, in just 30 seconds, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to say whatever you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say so far. But I want to bring in a couple bits of information that listeners raised in comments. One person from Oregon noted that some energy storage costs can be included in Oregon's RPS cost of compliance calculations. So there's a place where energy storage does fit into an RPS. And someone else pointed out that when you had the slide about all the maximum targets in many of those states, that percentage target continues to remain in force in future years. And if electricity demand were to increase in the state, then there would be an RPS driver of additional renewable energy development. So those were a couple bits of additional information. What else do you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say yet?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just kind of riff off that last comment since it spurred a couple thoughts. So this was the comment about continuing growth in RPS demand happening even after the targets have maxed out because load is continuing to grow. And so as long as those percentage targets remain binding, there's going to be some continued growth in demand just associated with underlying load growth. And that's absolutely true. That does remind me, though, of some work that Ed Holt has done recently, and that I think Warren, you and CISA sponsored, kind of asking the question, what happens after states meet their terminal RPS gears? And, you know, it's not always clear whether or not the percentage requirements continue or whether the obligations just end. And certainly there may be some states where those percentage requirements kind of continue indefinitely, but other cases where they don't, and where suddenly, you know, you've got a lot of renewable energy that is being freed up because it's no longer needed to meet RPS obligations in a given state. I think there's one other dynamic here, which is just retirements. I mean, you know, looking out to 2030, you know, that's, you know, say 30 years after some of the first RPS programs really started ramping up. And so, you know, pretty soon we're going to start seeing more and more RPS resources actually be decommissioned. And so that's going to be another source of incremental demand. Now, it won't, of course, increase necessarily the net amount of capacity or generation, but just from the perspective of, you know, developers who are looking for kind of investment opportunities and development opportunities, that will be, you know, another kind of frontier, as it were, in, you know, 10 years or so.
Good point. Well, Galen, you covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much. That was very useful, and I want to tell everybody on the line, remind them that these slides will be up on our website within 48 hours, and so you could download them and then refer back to them because there's a wealth of information in them. So thank you very much, Galen.
Thank you, Warren, and thanks everybody on the line here.
Bye now.